happy one for us because it puts the relevance of why this bill is needed up centre and front on the anniversary of repeal. And so we were also fortunate that Dr. Mary O'Shea's review was recently published, and the evidence given in that from the research that she carried out as to the lived experience of both providers and users of abortion services in the years since repeal and what that has meant in Ireland. So we're going to look at that today, and you can see I've got 4 speakers here with me. But just to briefly say what the bill, which is called the Health Regulation and Terminacy of Pregnancy Act 2018, would do. First of all, it would amend that act to provide abortion on request prior to fetal viability. It would abolish the 3-day waiting period for abortion on request, and it would allow for abortion on the grounds of fatal fetal abnormality likely to lead to the death of the fetus either before or within a year of birth, and allow for abortion where there is a risk to life or a serious harm of the health of the pregnant woman. That health includes mental health, and it would fully decriminalise the provision of abortion. So obviously these things are barriers in the law. The review that Mary O'Shea conducted shows what sort of barriers they are, and we're bringing this to the Dáil. But despite the historic and wonderful victory of repeal, we can see that there are still really problems with the legislation, and there's 700 approximately, maybe more, women and girls have been forced to travel abroad for abortion services since repeal, and that really, the figures are down hugely since prior to repeal, but it is still shame and a stain on our country that we do not provide full abortion care in this state. And that's why we're bringing the bill. And we know since the Irish Times report the day before yesterday that the Cabinet are seeking to delay this for a year. To me, that looks like a veiled attempt not to deal with it in the current Dáil at all. If they kick for touch for a year, it would mean that even if they were sincere about it, nothing would come before the Dáil till autumn next year. And then we're slap bang up against a general election, which really spells out that they don't want to deal with this. And we also know that there are some of the most vocal opponents of repeal before they were convinced by things like the 3-day limit, etc., or at least use the 3-day limit, the 3-day repeat visit, to push certain very senior politicians over the line into supporting this, that now they are fearful of trying to push that at them. And I think it was all said and summed up by the Taoiseach in his response to the review, which recommended lifting the 3-day waiting period, when he said, "I am not comfortable with this." Well, it's not about the discomfort of politicians, it's about the care that we give pregnant people in this country. And so I have a lineup of speakers here who are going to talk about these issues and who are backing the bill, and we are calling on all of the Oireachtas people who, they were outside the Dáil this morning supporting the photo call of the Together for Yes campaign on the anniversary repeal. We're calling on them to support the bill, and in particular the Green Party, who've indicated that they do support it, but they really have to step up to the plate on this one, given that they're in coalition with the conservative elements of society. So first up, I want to welcome and thank Alva Smith, who was a co-director of the Together for Yes campaign and a leading fighter on the question of abortion rights all her adult life in this country, and she's going to say a few words for us first. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Breed. And to start off by saying that I absolutely support the People Before Profit Bill, and as I welcomed the Mary O'Shea report, the review of the legislation, I particularly welcome the bill, which takes up those recommendations but also pushes them further, and in fact of course did so before the O'Shea report was published. I do want to say, just to address one issue in particular, which is that of decriminalisation, because in a sense the fact that abortion remains on the criminal statute books indicates that there is a belief basically which is that abortion is fundamentally wrong, evil and a bad thing. And I think that in fact history will show that women have been absolutely fighting on the right side of history by saying no, abortion is actually a good. It is good for women's health. It is good for women to be able to access the reproductive health care that they need in their own country, and indeed, let me say, in their own county where they live. So that keeping it on the statute books indicates this very ambivalent, confused attitude towards abortion. And I have certainly all my adult life, as you say, Breed, felt that what we are always fighting for is to have abortion integrated fully into reproductive health care. The law is actually arguably not at all a fit place to regulate the provision of healthcare services in any case, and we find ourselves in this situation because there is some perception and some ambivalence about abortion. So I think decriminalisation of the medical profession must actually be, that must be removed. There is no doubt that it continues to act as a deterrent, or as the European Court put it, a chill factor for medical professionals in offering this service on a very everyday, ordinary basis to the women who present to them in their GP clinics or in the maternity units around the country. And, I have great sympathy and understanding, actually, of that when you have a sense that you face potential criminal charges if there is one slip that you make. I mean, that is a very serious matter for practicing doctors, and there is absolutely no reason why we have to have it there. We do not need to have decriminalisation potentially of medical professionals in this regard. If there are errors or mistakes, or if there is fraudulent practice, that is picked up across our medical services in any cases. I'm sure Dr. Boylan would support me in this. There are the appropriate authorities who do that. So that is really the first point I wanted to make. And the second point, I think, also that I want particularly to emphasise, because they don't always get the attention that they need, is the issue of conscientious objection. Conscientious objection, it has been recommended in the O'Shea report that conscientious objection, that we put into place a model which would be based on the New Zealand situation, which would give employers the right to say to employees, i.e. doctors employed in hospitals, for example, that in order to protect the health and the rights of women to services to which they're legally entitled, that doctors may have to perform such services as are required by the hospital, including abortion. I think there is a great lack of clarity around conscientious objection in our legislation and in this country generally, and we need to address it. Personally, it's not actually in the bill, but I want to say it. I object very strenuously to the notion that conscience is attributed only to those who oppose abortion. In all good conscience, I believe that abortion is a good thing, and that is my conscientiously decided and determined and chosen position. So I think that we do need to do some more work around that. And I suppose my final point is that in repeal, and it is true, 5 years down the line, we are still fighting to ensure that all those who need abortion in this country can actually access it in an appropriate way. But in repeal, people voted to make abortion legal. And they didn't say, we've got to dot this I and cross this T. They said, look, solve this problem. We have a problem of people travelling. We need now, it is time for us to resolve this problem. Stop coming at us with all of these limits and caveats and reservations and so on and so forth. And I think that our government actually needs to listen to that, because our current legislation really does not give full expression to that trust. And I particularly object to An Taoiseach taking it upon himself to express this discomfort and reluctance to change, to reform the law, as was actually written into the law by that government, that there will be a review with a view to reforming what is not working for people who require an abortion. So it is illogical anyway for him to sit there and to say, I feel uncomfortable. I don't really care whether the Taoiseach feels comfortable or uncomfortable. What I care about is the well-being of people who need an abortion in this country, and I want them to be able to access it in every single locality in this country. I do not want them to have to travel. We had decades and decades and decades of that despicable and shameful situation. That now has to stop. I would also just conclude by saying that reluctance and discomfort seems to me to be not so much in respect of the law as rather the impact this may have on his party in forthcoming elections next year. I think that's where his discomfort lies, and I would like to point out to him that Fine Gael voters voted very heavily in favour of repeal, so that he perhaps should just trust his own party and his own voters rather more than he is doing at the moment. The final point is that this is now going to the Health Committee. That is the O'Shea report. I think that the bill today gives great opportunity for this to be discussed broadly in the Oireachtas. I am concerned that the Health Committee may not make recommendations on the O'Shea report. I think it really needs to make recommendations to be sent back to the Oireachtas, particularly on the implementation of those recommendations. That's the job of a committee, and that is the job I think that they should do. So
Thanks very
happy
much.
to answer questions later.
Thanks very much. So I'll take all the speakers if that's okay with you guys, and then you can come back to them with your questions. So I want to thank Peter Boylan, Dr. Peter Boylan, for coming, because I gave him very short notice, and I'm delighted to have him here with us today. He's a well-known figure in the campaign for repeal and articulated the view of the medical practice on this very well, and Peter's going to talk about that now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bríd. The areas that I'm going to say a few words about really are the question of the fetal abnormalities and the difficulties surrounding implementation of the legislation in that regard. And it ties in with the criminalisation of doctors if they make a mistake. And that has an inhibiting effect on making decisions in regard to whether or not a woman is eligible to have a termination when she's carrying a fetus with a serious fetal abnormality. It can be very hard for doctors to determine accurately whether or not a baby will die within the next 28 days of delivery. There are records of babies with serious problems lasting, living beyond that, and there are a few conditions where it's very clear that death will occur within an extremely short period of time, even minutes following delivery. So that the criminalisation aspect has a chilling effect on doctors making these decisions, because they know that even if they make a decision in good faith, that they may well be held to account in a criminal prosecution, and that has a very bad effect on them. And it's the only area of medicine where if you make a mistake, you're subjected to criminal charges. Everything else is a civil charge, or it goes before the medical council and so on. So it's different, and I think that needs to be addressed. The other issue with the fetal abnormalities is that the pregnant woman herself has virtually no input into the decision. And there are many couples who are very willing and in some cases happy to continue on with the pregnancy where there is a fatal fetal abnormality. And there are others then for whom this is just not possible for all sorts of reasons, and mainly for psychological reasons. They just can't face it. So people are different, but the women themselves, or couples, don't have an input into the decision as to whether or not termination should go ahead. Like, they'll get a diagnosis maybe of a clear fatal abnormality, and then it's up to them to make the decision as to whether or not they go ahead. But they don't have an input into a decision where there's a bit of a grey area as to whether or not death will occur within 28 days. And that's why I think the extension to a year is a reasonable compromise in that regard. It would provide some degree of comfort to doctors. What's happening in practice is that where there's a serious fetal abnormality but the doctors aren't confident that death will occur within 28 days, that these couples and these women are going mainly to the UK to have a termination. And that's happening with a substantial number of women. So that's reverting back to the way it was. And people in the UK, doctors in the UK are saying, why are you coming over here? I thought you sorted out your law. So that's an area that needs to be addressed in a fairly serious way. And that ties in, of course, with the criminalisation aspect, and that certainly needs to be removed, as Alva was saying. The other area which will be addressed is the 3-day interval, and that's infantilising of women. Most women know already when they turn up to a doctor whether or not they're going to have a termination. Doctors are very good at determining where a woman has some doubts, and will talk to them and counsel them appropriately, and particularly the doctors who are involved in providing the service. They're very aware of all of these questions. But it affects women with a disability, affects women in a coercive control situation or an abusive relationship. It affects women without much money, who are living in areas where there's little or no provision of the service, and so they'd have to get on a bus, get the money together, get on a bus, go to a county or up to Dublin where the service is available, and then get on the bus, go home again, and then come back again 3 days later to get the tablets which they knew they wanted in the first place. So it's the women who are most vulnerable who are suffering the most as a consequence of the 3-day interval. The current Minister for Health, Minister Donnelly, holds himself out as an advocate. Predecessor, Simon Harris, who pushed hard for the deadline of getting the legislation over the line, and Minister Donnelly needs to bring the same energy to getting the recommendations from the review implemented. And my impression is that when I was travelling around the country trying to make sure that various hospitals and so on had their ducks all in a row for the implementation of the service, I got the impression that there was a lot of inertia at senior HSE management level, and it's the senior HSE management who need to implement the availability by appointing people who will provide the service. That's their responsibility, and they need to get on with it. It's coming up to 5 years now since they've known about the problems. The people at lower levels in the HSE have done fabulous work, and the GPs have done fabulous work, and they need to get the recognition for that. But the more senior people really need to get their act together and start implementing appointments that will facilitate the provision of the service.
Effectively gives legal effect to the findings of the O'Shea report. The O'Shea report also, I think, confirms what many activists report the experiences, mainly of women, centre. I think at times the O'Shea report welcome about the PBP bill, because we need to take politics out of our abortion law. The review is part of our abortion law. Any law that is in operation that is about providing the best services would from time to time review that law and ensure that it is warned by the comments made by Leo Varadkar and some other politicians who have claimed to be uncomfortable with changes to indeed, for too long in this country, women have been subjected to medical care of clergy. And one of the things I think that we saw 5 years ago around the repeal campaign was a reckoning not just with the misogyny that was structured into the Irish state. And it was, I don't think, any coincidence that many of those kind of cases that particularly define that decade of the 1980s, of Joanne Hayes and the Kerry Babies case. I'm thinking of sorry, my mind's gone blank there. I'm thinking of there was Joanne Hayes, there was Anne Lovett, Eileen Flynn. Misogyny of the Irish state. So I think it's time that we moved beyond that. I think we need our current campaigning. I don't think in the many months in which we were knocking on doors, I don't think I ever encountered one person who said to me, I'm voting yes. Exit polls, one by RT and the other by the Irish Times, that showed that the vast majority of people, the reason behind their fertility over their own life. And we need a law that reflects that reflects our trust and the autonomy that women need to have. So we need to listen to them, we need to listen to service providers, and we need to design.
For-profit councillor in the Ballyfermot area, and Hazel is well known for her campaigning on these issues. She would have been one of the typical by way of fighting on the question of facilities and shelters for victims of coercion and domestic violence, as Peter referred to.
It's really good to be hearing the discussion from all the different peoples across the sector that have all the different viewpoints. But I think what it's clear is that we won the battle for choice of abortion, but in reality that I would be coming across working with people coming through our clinics, or whether it's friends, and women talking to them through going around our area, is the difficulty that they're finding actually access to travel outside of their area, as Peter has touched on there. And one of the issues I think that Alva had brought up that's really important is around removing the what you're doing is passing on that fear and that refusal onto those who are trying to access services, and having those conversations around, what we need to realise is when you're dealing with people who are fearful within a pregnancy, it's a very lonely space to be in, and with the treatment to say that they have the ability to know what they can do within their own lives. I mean, I'm a mother of 3 children. I know at this stage whether I have the ability to provide for another child or to go ahead with a pregnancy, and I should be given that right to be able to discuss that with my GP. So I think having that space for women to be able to come in and, as I said, speak to their local GP, because with the ability around the conscious piece or the fear pieces, they're moving stranger to then explain your life experiences to then justify having that access. So there's a whole lot around it that needs to be really taken serious, and I would urge others to give them that support within their choices in life. And I'll finish on that then.
Thanks very much, Hazel. So there's a lot there, and I'll take questions.
Stephen Donnelly had the same energy as Simon Harris, or brought the same enthusiasm and zeal. Why do you think he isn't? And can I ask Breed, have you heard from the government about the 1-year timed amendment? What are the obviously there's some unease at Cabinet, and we've heard that. We know that there are ministers like Simon Coveney who pushed for the 3-day wait originally. Why do you think Leo Varadkar made those comments? Do you think they were electorally motivated, or do you think it was to appease the Cabinet? Thanks.
So Peter, you go first.
I think in short it's but as a proclaimed advocate for women's health and women's access to health, I think he really does need to be.
This was so energised was not because he had his Weetabix, but because he felt the pressure from below. There was thousands and thousands of women on the street. The campaign had huge momentum behind it, and he really movement to put the pressure on the government to respond to the needs of women as per the evidence from Mario O'Shea's review. Because I know they're going to try and kick for touch for this tomorrow. They haven't contacted me, Jennifer. They haven't said anything. I don't know where they're going to things, and I honestly believe they're kicking for touch until this Dáil is finished and a new Dáil comes in, and then it'll be their responsibility. So it's evident to me that the movement has to greatest difficulty. If you have a good job and you have money and you live in Dublin and you've plenty of access, then and repeal worked. There's less and less women travelling, and most of us can access the services, but there's a whole cohort out there that can't. And it's incredible that the English doctors are saying it's that they have to say, I thought you sorted this out, why did you come here? That says it all, really. So I think the movement really has to get behind not just this bill, but the idea that the government must act. This bill will come and go tomorrow. It won't be gone off the agenda. We'll keep pressurising. As was said to me on the way over here, many women after 12 weeks change their minds because they could become homeless, which is a big feature in this country at the moment. Their mental health might not be the best. There's all sorts of reasons why the 12-week limit is a barrier. And I know the National Women's Councils and other bodies are really pushing for it. So yeah, just briefly to say I haven't heard from the government, and you want to talk to Alva there.
Well, I think, Jennifer, you were asking coming elections, and my blunt answer is yes, I do. And one of the things that I have been very conscious of myself about abortion, what was happening, and repeal, and seemed to take pleasure and to be pleased that we had actually made, because it did lead me certainly to think that there would be movement on the 3-year reform I noticed that in my own life and what I was being invited to speak at and contribute to. For example, I'm being very direct with you here, and elements in government, perhaps particularly Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, are much more conservative than their actual electorate, and which was demonstrated very plainly, by the way, in the result of both referendums. And I think that they need to, this spurious discomfort and reluctance, and no reason is really given for these things. They need to stop that, and they need to, as Breed says, smell the coffee, and start moving forward and understanding that in fact an electorate will trust you out there who don't like it tough. But that is what we're going for, that's what we stand for, because it leaves all of us thinking, what on earth does this government actually stand for? They need not think that that's over in this country. We will get out there and we will do it, and we will be starting tomorrow.
Yes, please, Debbie Smith. I was just wondering, currently 11 hospitals provide this abortion care out of 19. Is there any room for conscientious objection?
It shouldn't be allowed, and it should be up to the HSE to appoint people who are trained and willing to provide. To hold my breath. But I think it is an issue that when we see conscientious objection being used, that we also have reports of false references being given to women where they're being pushed onto rogue clinics instead of onto somebody who will provide the abortion care that's needed.
Have a right to conscientiously object, and you can't force people to do something that they have an objection to doing. However, as Breed said, it's nurses as well. When I was travelling around the country, for example, in one hospital in particular, when a consultant was doing it will take time. However, it's been 5 years now, so really they need to get on with it, and they've known about this problem for a long, long time. So the senior management in the HSE legislation has provided for, and if they don't provide those people in those positions, well then they're not really doing their job correctly.
Yeah.
So you have a question? And a half. Things might move faster, but at 6 o'clock we're having a pro-choice rally outside the Dáil. And just to be clear, it's not Breed Smith's rally. Care for abortion, who makes that choice, is left behind in the very remote parts of rural Ireland. Poor women being discriminated against. If we stand for equality, then that's what it must mean. So tomorrow night's really important. So at 6 o'clock at the Dáil, it's not going to be a very long to re-kickstart what was an amazing movement that made the government smell the coffee. We need it now to make the government make the changes that are required. And thanks for the question.
In terms of delivering on repeal?
Well, I need the public's terribly hopeful, but I suspect Nasa Hurricane, who's now rogue from the Green Party, will vote on this issue. And I think that that's a terrible shame, because they did win the hearts and minds by getting 12 TDs into. But will they go against the government? We'll see. We'll see what happens tomorrow.